Dust swirled through Copper Creek as little Isla stepped onto the wooden boardwalk, her bare feet caked with dirt, her dress stained with tears and yesterday's mud. In one hand she clutched a worn rag doll. With the other she reached for the fringed sleeve of Mark, the Apache warrior whose presence alone made townsfolk cross the street. Her mother's body still lay warm in their shack at the edge of town, consumption having claimed its final victory before dawn. "Sir, can I stay with you? Mom just died," she whispered, voice breaking like thin ice. The busy street fell silent. What could drive a child to seek shelter with the most feared outsider in the territory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence that followed, Ayla's plea, seemed to stretch across the dusty street like a taut rope. Mark felt every eye in Copper Creek boring into him, waiting, judging. The weight of their stares was familiar. 17 years of sideways glances and mothers pulling children closer when he passed. But the weight of this small girl's hope was something altogether different. "Come," he said simply, his deep voice barely audible. He turned, not waiting to see if she would follow. The leather medicine pouch hanging at his hip swung gently as he walked. Inside were the last remnants of a life long buried, an eagle feather from his father's headdress, a smooth river stone his mother had carried, a scrap of blood-stained cloth, sacred things, memory things. Mark had been barely 20 when the soldiers came. The peace talks had been going well, or so the Apache thought, but something went wrong. Words mistranslated, intentions misunderstood, then gunfire. His father, the respected medicine man, Two Hawks, had fallen first, then his mother, his sister. While Mark had been hunting, fate spared him the bullets, but cursed him with survival. He led Ayla down the street, past Henderson's general store where Mrs. Henderson watched with her hand over her mouth. Past the saloon where rough men fell silent, whiskey glasses frozen halfway to their lips. Past the church where Pastor Reed stood on the steps, his Bible clutched to his chest like a shield. "I can't just take her," someone called out. Mark didn't turn to see who. His small cabin sat at the edge of town, where the settlement surrendered to wilderness. One room with a stone fireplace, a bed, a table he'd made himself, a trunk containing 3 shirts, a spare pair of boots, and a cavalry officer's journal, the writings of the one white man who'd tried to understand before a Comanche arrow found him. The little girl followed him inside, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth floor. She still clutched her doll, knuckles white with tension. "Are you hungry?" Mark asked. His English was perfect, though he spoke rarely. Education had been important to his father, who believed understanding the white man's tongue might save them. It hadn't. Ayla nodded, her dark eyes taking in the sparse cabin. "Yes, sir." Mark moved to the fire, where a pot of bean stew had been simmering. He'd learned to cook from necessity, not skill. The food was simple but nourishing. "My name is Mark," he said, ladling stew into a wooden bowl. "Not sir." "Mark," she repeated softly. "Then, they call you Apache. That is what I am, not who." He handed her the bowl. "Your name is Ayla." She nodded, settling cross-legged on the floor. "Mama said it means light. Are you going to send me away?" The question hung between them. Mark touched the medicine pouch at his hip, feeling the contours of the objects inside. Objects that connected him to people long gone. He understood what it was to be the last one left. "No," he said finally. "I will not send you away." A knock at the door interrupted them. Sheriff Wilson stood outside, hand resting meaningfully on his holster. Behind him stood Mrs. Lancaster, the schoolteacher, and Miss Peterson from the general store. "Mark," the sheriff began, removing his hat. "We need to discuss this situation." Mark stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly filling the frame. "There is nothing to discuss. A single man can't just take in a child, especially," the sheriff trailed off. But his meaning was clear, "especially an Indian." Mrs. Lancaster stepped forward. "The girl needs proper care. A woman's guidance. She has no one, Mark said simply. That's why there are orphanages, Peterson added. In Santa Fe, no. Mark's voice remained calm, but carried the immovable quality of stone. She stays. Behind him, Ayla ate her stew quietly, watching the adults with wary eyes that had seen too much. The medicine pouch at Mark's hip seemed to grow heavier, the memories inside whispering to him. Once he had been unable to protect his family. Now fate had given him another chance. The sheriff sighed. We'll return tomorrow with the circuit judge. This isn't over. The trio retreated, casting troubled glances back at the cab. Mark closed the door and turned to find Ayla watching him, her empty bowl cradled in small hands. Thank you, she said. Outside, darkness gathered as the town of Copper Creek buzzed with the scandal. Inside, Mark stoked the fire against the coming night, watching as the orphaned child curled up near its warmth, her doll clutched to her chest. Something long dormant stirred within him, a feeling he'd thought had died along with his bloodkin all those years ago. The medicine pouch at his hip held his past. But perhaps this small, fragile girl represented something he'd never dared hope for, a future. Morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, casting a golden rectangle across Ayla's sleeping form. Mark had been awake for hours, watching the child breathe, wondering what madness had possessed him to challenge the entire town. He'd spent 17 years avoiding confrontation, keeping to himself, surviving through invisibility. Now he'd made himself the center of everyone's attention. Ayla stirred, her small hands instinctively reaching for the silver locket around her neck. The tarnished oval had been her constant companion since Mark had first noticed her around town, always trailing behind her mother like a shadow. He'd never seen it open. "Where's Mama?" she asked, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then remembrance darkened her eyes. Oh. That single syllable contained worlds of grief. Mark recognized it, had spoken it himself in the days after the massacre. "I must go to work," Mark said, uncomfortable with the silence. "Henderson needs wood split." Ayla sat up, smoothing her dirt-stained dress. "I can help. You will stay here," Mark replied. Then, seeing her face fall, added, "Rest today. Tomorrow will be soon enough for decisions." He left her with a plate of cornbread and instructions not to open the door for anyone but him. The town was already stirring when he emerged, and the whispers began immediately. Mark kept his eyes forward as he walked to Henderson's general store. Old man Henderson was waiting, arms crossed. "I can't have you working here anymore, Apache. Bad enough before. But now," he glanced around nervously. "Crawford's been asking questions. Says you had no right to take that girl." Mark stood silently. Thomas Crawford owned half the county and most of the people in it. His word was practically law. "I need the work," Mark said finally. "And I need customers. They won't come if you're here." Henderson's eyes softened slightly. "Look, I don't agree with it. That girl needed someone. But you picked a fight you can't win." Mark turned away without another word. The same scene repeated at the livery stable and the freight office. By midday it was clear Copper Creek had closed ranks against him. He was crossing the street when Mrs. Lancaster, the school teacher, intercepted him. Her grey hair was pulled into a severe bun, but her eyes were kind. "Walk with me," she said, not really a request. "People are watching." They moved toward the schoolhouse at the end of the street. "I knew Ayla's mother," Mrs. Lancaster said quietly. "Sophia was a good woman, who made one mistake, loving a man who wasn't free to marry her. When he died in that mine collapse, she was left alone and pregnant." Mark said nothing, but he listened. "Sophia worked herself to death keeping that child fed, took in laundry, cleaned houses, nursed the sick when no one else would, all while the same people who used her services whispered behind her back." The older woman's voice hardened. "And now those righteous souls are suddenly concerned about Ayla's welfare." They reached the schoolhouse steps. Mrs. Lancaster turned to face him. "Why did you say yes to her? You must have known what would happen." Mark touched the locket through his shirt pocket. He'd found it on the floor of the cabin that morning. Ayla must have removed it in her sleep. I know what it is to be alone, he said simply. Mrs. Lancaster studied him. The circuit judge arrives tomorrow. Crawford wants Ayla sent to the orphanage in Santa Fe. He's claiming it's inappropriate for her to stay with you. Because I am Apache. That's part of it. She hesitated. Mark, Sophia told me something before she died. Something about Ayla's father. Mark waited. He wasn't a minor. That was the story Sophia told to protect them both. Mrs. Lancaster lowered her voice further. Ayla's father was Thomas Crawford's younger brother, James. The revelation hit Mark like a physical blow. Crawford, who had spent years making it clear that Indians were barely human, had a half Apache niece. Does Crawford know? I believe he suspects. James visited Sophia regularly before he died. There were rumors. Mrs. Lancaster straightened her skirt. I think that's why he's so determined to send Ayla away. Not out of concern, but to bury the evidence of his family's indiscretion. That evening, Mark returned to the cabin to find Ayla sitting exactly where he'd left her, as if afraid to disturb anything. She looked up hopefully when he entered. Did you bring food? I ate all the cornbread. For the first time in years, Mark felt the corners of his mouth tug upward. Not quite a smile, but close. Yes, little one. I brought food. As they ate, Ayla fingered her locket nervously. They're going to take me away, aren't they? Mark looked at the child across from him, seeing in her eyes the same wounded dignity he'd carried since losing his family. With sudden clarity, he understood that some battles must be fought, even when victory seemed impossible. Not without a fight, he promised. Dawn broke with the sound of horses approaching. Mark was already awake, sitting on his single chair, watching Ayla sleep on his bed. He'd spent the night on the floor back against the wall, listening to the night sounds with the vigilance that had kept him alive all these years. The sheriff's star gleamed in the early light as Wilson dismounted outside the cabin. Behind him rode Judge Harmon, a barrel-chested man whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his strict adherence to the law. Thomas Crawford sat astride an expensive black stallion, his well-tailored suit out of place in the dusty frontier town. Mark stepped outside, closing the door softly behind him. Mark, the sheriff, nodded, hand resting casually near his holster. Judge Harmon's here about the girl. The judge dismounted with a grunt, adjusting his spectacles. This the Indian who's taken in Sophia's child, Apache, Mark corrected quietly. And yes, Crawford remained on his horse, looking down at Mark with undisguised contempt. This is a simple matter, Judge. The girl needs proper care. Christian care. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, his star catching the sunlight again. That badge represented law and order in Copper Creek. But whose law and whose order? Let's discuss this civilly, Judge Harmon suggested, gesturing toward town. At my temporary offices, the child stays here, Mark said. Crawford's face reddened. You don't give orders, Indian. The girl comes with us now. Gentlemen, the judge intervened. Let's all take a breath. Sheriff, perhaps you could fetch Mrs. Lancaster. I understand she was close with the deceased. As the sheriff rode off, the door creaked open behind Mark. Ayla stood there, small and disheveled, but with a determined set to her chin that reminded Mark of his own mother. I'm not going to the orphanage, she stated, her voice surprisingly steady. Judge Harmon's eyes softened. Child, no one's sending you anywhere just yet. We're simply trying to determine what's best. He's best, Ayla said, pointing at Mark. He's the only one who said yes when I asked for help. Crawford dismounted, his patience visibly wearing thin. This is absurd. The law is clear about orphaned children. The law, interrupted a new voice, also recognizes the wishes of a dying mother. Mrs. Lancaster approached on foot, the sheriff trailing behind her. She carried a folded document in her hand. Judge Harmon, she nodded respectfully. Before Sophia passed, she signed this letter. I witnessed it, as did Dr. Thompson. She handed the paper to the judge, who unfolded it and read silently, his bushy eyebrows rising steadily. This appears to be a last will and testament, he said finally, naming one Mark II Rivers as guardian to her daughter, Ayla. Crawford snatched the paper. Impossible. Sophia wouldn't. Sophia knew she was dying, Mrs. Lancaster said evenly, and she knew how this town would treat her daughter, a half-Mexican, half-white child with no father to claim her. The mother was delirious with fever, Crawford argued. This can't possibly be legal. The judge retrieved the document. It's crude but adequately worded. The signatures appear genuine. Dr. Thompson is a respected physician. Mark stood perfectly still, as surprised as anyone by this development. Sophia had barely spoken 10 words to him in all the years he'd lived in Copper Creek. Yet somehow she'd seen something in him that others missed. Crawford wasn't finished. Even if she did sign this, it's against public decency. An unmarried man, an Indian at that, raising a young girl. The mere suggestion is scandalous. There is precedent, the judge mused, stroking his beard. The Bennett case in Santa Fe, the Parker situation in Tucson. He glanced at Mark. Do you accept this responsibility, Mr. Rivers? It's no small thing to raise a child. I do. 2 words, spoken with quiet certainty. Crawford exploded. This is Crawford land he's squatting on. I could evict him tomorrow. A flicker of uncertainty crossed the judge's face. Property disputes were complicated, especially when Indians were involved. I will consider all aspects of this case, Judge Harmon said carefully. In the meantime, the child remains with Mr. Rivers, as per her mother's written wishes. Sheriff, you'll check on them daily. He held up a hand as Crawford began to protest. This is temporary, until a full hearing can be arranged. As the men departed, Crawford fuming, the sheriff uncomfortable, the judge deep in thought. Mrs. Lancaster lingered. I don't understand, Mark said quietly. Why would Sophia choose me? She saw you once, Mrs. Lancaster replied, sharing your food with a stray dog when you thought no one was looking. She said any man who shows kindness when there's nothing to gain must have a good heart. She paused. I didn't lie about the will. I merely omitted that I wrote it at Sophia's request, when she could no longer hold a pen. Mark watched her walk away, then felt a small hand slip into his. Ayla looked up at him, her dark eyes solemn. Are they going to take me away? Mark squeezed her hand gently. Not today, little one, not today. The rest of the day passed in awkward silence. Mark went about his chores, chopping wood, fetching water, tending his small garden while Ayla watched from the doorway, uncertain where she fit in this new arrangement. As sunset painted the sky in fiery hues, Mark realized he hadn't planned for the practical aspects of caring for a child. Are you hungry? He asked, setting down his axe. Ayla nodded, her small hands fidgeting with the hem of her dress. I can cook, she offered. Mama taught me. Mark shook his head. Not tonight. Tonight you rest. Inside he stirred the remnants of yesterday's stew and added water, stretching it for 2. While it heated, he searched through his few possessions, finding an old shirt that might serve as a nightgown. It will be too big, he said, handing it to her, but clean. After they ate, an uncomfortable realization settled over both of them. The cabin had only one bed. You sleep there, Mark said, gesturing to the narrow cot. I will be comfortable here. He pointed to the bearskin rug before the fireplace. Ayla's eyes widened. But it's your bed, and now it is yours. As night deepened, Mark worked by firelight, his large hands surprisingly nimble as he fashioned a wooden comb from a piece of pine. His own hair, worn long in the Apache tradition, was kept neat with a similar tool. He noticed Ayla's tangled locks, and remembered his sister how their mother would comb her hair each night, singing softly. Come, he said, patting the floor before him. Hesitantly, Ayla settled at his feet. With gentle strokes, Mark began working the tangles from her dark hair. Neither spoke, but the rhythmic motion had a calming effect on them both. When he finished, Ayla yawned, the day's emotions finally catching up to her. Sleep now, he said, helping her into the bed. As he turned to spread his blanket by the fire, Ayla's voice stopped him. Will you tell me a story? Mama always told me stories. Mark froze, uncertainty washing over him. What stories could he tell this child? His people's tales of creation, the bloody history of their subjugation, his own path of loss and exile. I do not know the stories your mother told, he said finally. Then tell me your stories, Ayla said simply. Mark settled back against the wall, the firelight casting his face in sharp relief. My people believe the world began in darkness, he began slowly, and that we are all connected to the stars. He spoke of changing woman, who created the first humans, of Coyote the trickster, of the sacred mountains where the gods dwell. He chose the gentler tales, steering away from those of war and vengeance. When he looked over, Ayla's eyes had drifted shut, her breathing deep and even. Rising quietly, Mark moved to the trunk at the foot of the bed. From inside he pulled a worn woolen blanket, faded but clean. With careful movements, he unfolded it and spread it over the sleeping child. His mother had made this blanket, weaving it during the cold winter months, when he was younger than Ayla. The intricate patterns told stories of their people, stories now preserved only in his memory and in the faded threads of this blanket. For a moment Mark stood watching Ayla sleep, an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. This child trusted him completely, had chosen him when she had no one else. The responsibility of it was terrifying. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Sheriff Wilson stood outside, rifle cradled in his arms. Making my rounds, he said gruffly. Judge orders. Mark stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him. She asleep? The sheriff asked, nodding toward the cabin. Yes. Wilson shifted uncomfortably. Look, I'm not saying I agree with Crawford, but you need to understand what you're up against. Man like that doesn't lose gracefully. I am familiar with men who take what they want, Mark replied, his voice flat. The sheriff studied him in the moonlight. You really think you can raise her? Proper like? Mark thought of the blanket covering Ayla, of the stories he'd just shared, of the wooden comb he'd made, small things, but a beginning. I will learn, he said. Wilson nodded slowly. Sophia was a good woman. If she thought you were the right choice, he left the thought unfinished. I'll be back tomorrow. Crawford's men have been drinking at the saloon, talking big. Best keep your eyes open. After the sheriff departed, Mark returned inside. The fire had burned low, casting the cabin in soft shadow. He added another log, watching the flames catch and grow. The woolen blanket rose and fell with Ayla's breathing, its faded patterns barely visible in the firelight. His mother had told him once that every blanket she wove contained prayers for protection, for prosperity, for peace. He wondered if those ancient prayers might now extend to this child, so different from him yet somehow entrusted to his care. Mark settled on the bearskin rug, back against the wall, knife within easy reach. He would not sleep deeply tonight, or perhaps for many nights to come. But for the first time in 17 years, he was not merely surviving. He was needed. Morning arrived with a pounding at the door. Mark rose from his place by the fire, muscles stiff from a night spent sitting upright. Ayla stirred beneath the woolen blanket, but didn't wake. Judge Harmon stood outside, flanked by Sheriff Wilson and Pastor Reed. Behind them gathered a small crowd of townsfolk, some curious, others openly hostile. Town council meeting, the judge announced without preamble. Your presence is requested. His eyes moved past Mark to the sleeping child. Just you, for now. Mark hesitated. I cannot leave her alone. Lancaster stepped forward from the crowd. I'll stay with her, she offered. If that's acceptable. Mark nodded his thanks, collecting his knife and stepping outside. The walk to the town hall passed in tense silence, with townsfolk falling in behind them like a funeral procession. The town council chamber, normally Henderson's back storeroom, was already crowded when they arrived. At the head table sat Mayor Simmons, a thin man with perpetual ink stains on his fingers, flanked by Crawford and Dr. Thompson. The leather-bound town registry lay open before them, its gilt-edged pages catching the lamplight. Order, called Mayor Simmons as Mark entered. The murmuring crowd fell silent. This emergency session of the Copper Creek Town Council is now in session. We are here to discuss the matter of guardianship for the minor child, Ayla Martinez. Crawford stood immediately. This is a waste of time. The law is clear. An orphaned child belongs in a proper orphanage, or with a respectable family, not with—" He gestured dismissively toward Mark. Dr. Thompson cleared his throat. "While I agree the situation is unusual, I must confirm that I did witness Sophia Martinez's final wishes. She specifically named Mark Two Rivers as guardian to her daughter." Mark stood silently at the back of the room, aware of the stares, but focused on the registry. That book held births, deaths, property deeds, marriages, the official record of Copper Creek's existence. His name appeared nowhere in its pages. Until now, he had preferred it that way. Mayor Simmons adjusted his spectacles. "The legal question before us is complex. Judge Harmon, your thoughts?" The judge stepped forward. In territorial law, a mother's dying declaration carries significant weight. However, there are considerations of propriety and community standards. "The girl is half Mexican," called out a woman from the crowd. "Maybe the Apache is her real father." A ripple of shocked whispers spread through the room. Sophia wasn't that kind of woman. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, objected. She kept to herself, did honest work. Then why choose an Indian over decent Christian folk? Mark remained still as the debate swirled around him, arguments flying like arrows. This was familiar territory being discussed as if he weren't present, his fate decided by others. "Enough." Judge Harmon's voice cut through the chaos. "This helps no one, least of all the child." Crawford seized the opportunity. "Precisely my point, Judge. This controversy alone proves the arrangement is untenable. For the girl's sake, send her to Santa Fe. May I speak?" The quiet request came from Jacob Miller, the town blacksmith. A mountain of a man with hands like anvils, Miller commanded respect through sheer physical presence. Mayor Simmons nodded. "Go ahead, Jacob." Miller stepped forward, wiping his perpetually sooty hands on his leather apron. "I've known Mark for 7 years. He's worked for me off and on. Never said much, but always honest. Hard-working." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "My father fought Apaches, lost an arm to them, taught me to hate him. But Mark here, he's different." Crawford scoffed. "Different how? They're all savages." He returned a wallet full of cash that Henderson dropped last winter. Miller continued, ignoring Crawford. "Could have kept it. Nobody would have known, but he didn't." The blacksmith looked around the room. "Man like that has character." Dr. Thompson nodded slowly. "He brought medicine to the Wilkins family during the fever outbreak. Wouldn't take payment." Other voices joined in. Small kindnesses remembered, quiet dignity observed. Crawford slammed his hand on the table. "This is absurd. We're discussing allowing an Apache warrior to raise a white child." "Half Mexican," Mrs. Lancaster corrected, entering the room. "And currently missing her guardian." She fixed Mark with a pointed look. "She's awake and asking for you." Mark turned to go, but Judge Harmon raised his hand. "One moment. We need to resolve this matter." Mayor Simmons reached for the town registry, dipping his pen in ink. "I propose a compromise. Mark Two Rivers will be granted temporary guardianship for 1 month. During this time, Sheriff Wilson will make daily checks on the child's welfare. Miss Lancaster will ensure the girl receives proper education. At the month's end, we'll reconvene to make a final determination." Crawford started to object, but Judge Harmon cut him off. "This seems reasonable. All in favor?" A chorus of ayes, some reluctant, filled the room. Opposed? Crawford and a few others raised their hands, but they were the minority. "Very well. It's decided." The mayor carefully recorded the decision in the registry, the scratch of his pen audible in the suddenly quiet room. "Mark Two Rivers, you are hereby granted temporary guardianship of Ayla Martinez, subject to review in 1 month's time." As Mark left, Miller fell into step beside him. "Crawford won't let this rest," the blacksmith warned quietly. "Watch yourself, and if you need work, my forge is always open to you." Mark nodded his thanks. The town registry might now acknowledge his existence, but he harbored no illusions. 1 month wasn't much time to prove himself worthy of raising a child, especially to those who had already decided he was not. But it was a beginning. Dawn found Mark already at work behind the cabin, hammering together scraps of lumber. The one-room dwelling that had served him well for years now felt inadequate. Ayla needed her own space, a place that was truly hers. "What are you making?" Ayla appeared beside him, hair tousled from sleep, wearing the oversized shirt he'd given her. "A partition," Mark explained, driving another nail. "For privacy." Ayla watched him work, handing him nails when he reached out. Her small presence beside him felt both strange and somehow familiar, like an echo of his past life, with his family. "Can I help?" she asked, after a while. Mark considered the question. In his tribe, children participated in daily work from an early age. It taught them responsibility, skills, and their place within the community. "Yes," he decided. "You can hold this board." Together they worked through the morning, Mark teaching without many words, demonstrating instead. By midday, a simple wooden screen divided the cabin, creating a small sleeping area for Ayla. "It's mine?" she asked, eyes wide. Mark nodded. "Your space." Later, while cleaning his tools, Mark noticed Ayla had disappeared inside. Curious, he peered through the cabin window. She was sitting cross-legged in her new space, head bent over something in her lap. Her face held an expression of intense concentration he recognized from his own childhood, the look of creation. When he entered, she quickly tucked whatever she was working on beneath the blanket. Mark didn't pry. Privacy was a gift he understood well. "We need supplies," he said instead. "Will you come to town with me?" Her eager nod surprised him. Most children in town scattered when he approached. The walk to Henderson's store was tense. Eyes followed them. Whispers trailed behind. Mark felt Ayla move closer to him, her small hand slipping into his. The simple trust of the gesture caught him off guard. Inside the store, Mrs. Henderson watched them warily but didn't refuse service. Mark kept his request simple: fabric for clothes, soap, food staples. As he paid, Ayla gazed longingly at a display of pencils and paper. Mark hesitated, then added a single pencil and small tablet to his purchases. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose, but she said nothing as she wrapped the items. That evening, after a simple meal, Mark handed Ayla the paper and pencil. Her face lit up with such joy that he felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. "Thank you," she exclaimed, immediately settling on the floor with her treasures. Mark busied himself mending his shirt, stealing occasional glances at the child. Her tongue poked slightly from the corner of her mouth as she drew, reminding him painfully of his sister. "Mark?" Ayla's voice broke the comfortable silence. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded, setting aside his mending. "Why do people in town look at you the way they do? Like they're scared?" The question hung between them. Mark considered how to explain generations of hatred and fear to an 8-year-old child. "My people and theirs fought for many years," he said finally. "They remember only the fighting, not the reasons for it." Ayla seemed to consider this. "Did you fight?" "No. I was too young, but I lost my family to their soldiers." Her eyes widened. "Like I lost my mama?" "Yes," he said softly. "Like that." She returned to her drawing with renewed concentration. Mark thought the conversation finished until she spoke again. "Then we're the same," she declared with a child's simple logic. "We both lost our families." Before Mark could respond, she rose and crossed to him, presenting her drawing with solemn ceremony. On the rough paper, 2 stick figures stood hand in hand, one tall with long black hair, one small with a triangle dress. Behind them was a simple square house, with smoke curling from the chimney. The sun smiled down from one corner. "It's us," Ayla explained, unnecessarily. "In our home." Mark stared at the drawing, emotion tightening his throat. In the Apache tradition, art was sacred, a way of capturing spirit and memory. This simple drawing, created by a child's unskilled hand, seemed more powerful to him than any painting he'd seen in white men's buildings. "It is good," he managed, carefully setting the drawing on the table. "Can we put it on the wall?" Ayla asked, bouncing slightly on her toes. "So everyone can see." Mark nodded, finding a small nail and gently tapping it into the log wall. Together they hung the drawing in a place of honor near the fireplace. That night, as Isla slept in her new private corner, Mark sat by the dying fire, studying the childish artwork. The straight lines and simple shapes revealed a truth his heart had been reluctant to acknowledge. They were becoming a family. Sheriff Wilson's daily check the next morning paused at the sight of the drawing prominently displayed. "She did that?" he asked, nodding toward the paper. "Yes," Mark replied, a hint of pride in his voice. The sheriff studied the drawing longer than seemed necessary for such a simple thing. "Huh?" he said finally, making a note in his book. "Interesting." After he left, Mark caught Isla watching from her corner. "Is the sheriff going to take me away?" she asked, quietly. Mark looked at the drawing again, the simple happiness it depicted, the hope it represented. "No," he said with newfound determination. "He is not. You need to go to school," Mark said over breakfast on their 5th morning together. The words hung in the air between them. Isla looked up from her cornmeal mush, eyes wide. "School? Mrs. Lancaster is expecting you." Mark had arranged it yesterday, an uncomfortable conversation that ended with unexpected support from the school teacher. "Will the other children be mean to me?" Isla asked, setting down her spoon. A perceptive question that cut to the heart of Mark's own concerns. "Perhaps," he answered honestly, "but learning is important. My father believed this." After breakfast, Mark helped Ayla prepare, washing her face and hands, combing her hair. Her dress, the only one she owned, was clean but worn thin at the elbows. Another problem to solve. For now it would have to do. The walk to the schoolhouse felt like marching into enemy territory. Mark kept his face impassive as they passed townsfolk, who stopped to stare. Ayla pressed closer to his side. Outside the weathered schoolhouse, children played in the yard, their laughter cutting off abruptly as Mark and Ayla approached. Parents gathered nearby fell silent, some pulling their children protectively closer. Mrs. Lancaster appeared in the doorway, bell in hand. "Good morning, Ayla," she said warmly. "We're pleased to have you join us." Mark knelt down to Ayla's level, aware of the watching eyes. "I will come when school ends," he promised. "Learn well." Ayla nodded solemnly, then surprised him by throwing her arms around his neck in a quick hug before racing up the steps to Mrs. Lancaster's side. The school teacher gave Mark a reassuring nod before ushering Ayla inside. The morning stretched endlessly. Mark worked at Miller's forge, hammering metal with more force than necessary, his thoughts on the schoolhouse across town. At midday, he found himself walking past the building, listening for Ayla's voice among the children reciting their lessons. When the final bell rang, Mark was waiting. Children poured from the schoolhouse, giving him a wide berth. He searched their faces for Ayla, relaxing only when he spotted her, emerging last, clutching something in her hand. "Mark, look!" She ran to him, face alight with excitement. In her hand was a small slate pencil, worn to half its original length. "Mrs. Lancaster says I can keep this for practicing my letters at home." The simple joy in her voice eased the tension he'd carried all day. "You enjoyed your lessons, Miss Dams?" "Lancaster says I'm smart," Ayla announced proudly. "I already know my letters better than Billy Thompson, and he's 10. As they walked home, Ayla chatted about her day, the reading circle, the arithmetic problems, the history lesson. Mark listened, noting how she carefully avoided mentioning the other children. "Did you make friends?" he asked finally. Ayla's steps slowed. "Not yet." Her fingers closed protectively around the slate pencil. "Jenny Miller sat with me at lunch, but her mama called her away." That evening, Mark watched as Ayla practiced her letters on the small tablet he'd purchased, using the precious pencil with careful concentration. The slate pencil lay nearby, a treasured possession. "Will you help me?" she asked, looking up, "with my lessons?" Mark hesitated. His own education had been different. Learning to track game, to understand the movement of stars, to know which plants healed and which harmed. The white man's schooling was largely foreign to him. I will try, he said, settling beside her. Together they bent over the tablet, Ayla sounding out words while Mark listened. His own reading was limited, learned from a sympathetic cavalry officer years ago, but adequate to help with her simple lessons. The next morning they repeated their journey to the schoolhouse. This time Mark noticed Jacob Miller's wife Martha watching from the milliner's shop window, her expression thoughtful, as she observed them pass. The second day brought the first real trouble. Mark arrived at the schoolhouse to find Ayla with a torn book and tear-stained face. "What happened?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "Tommy Crawford said I shouldn't touch the books with my dirty hands," she whispered. "He said Indians can't read anyway." Mark felt a familiar anger rise, but kept his voice calm. "Tommy is wrong. He said his uncle is going to run us out of town." Ayla's voice dropped even lower. "Is that true?" "No," Mark said firmly, though uncertainty gnawed at him. Crawford's influence was powerful, his determination to separate them obvious. That night, after Ayla was asleep, Mark sat by the fire practicing his own letters. The words came slowly, painfully, but he persisted, determined to improve enough to help with her studies. Sheriff Wilson's arrival interrupted his efforts. The lawman glanced at the paper in Mark's hands, but made no comment as he completed his nightly check. "Any trouble at school?" Wilson asked, surprising Mark with the question. "Some," Mark admitted. "Crawford's nephew." Wilson sighed. "Figured as much. That boy's mean as a snake, just like his uncle." He turned to go, then paused. "You know, most men in your position wouldn't bother with schooling for the girl, especially knowing how folks around here feel." Mark returned to his practice. "Most men in my position would not have a girl to school." The sheriff studied him a moment longer. "No," he said finally. "I suppose they wouldn't." He nodded at the slate pencil on the table. "Miss Lancaster says she's quick with her letters." "Yes," Mark said, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "She is very smart." After Wilson left, Mark returned to his laborious writing. The slate pencil rested beside his paper, a humble object, transformed into something precious, a key that might unlock doors long closed to both of them. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil filled the forge as Mark shaped the glowing iron. 2 weeks had passed since Ayla began school, 2 weeks of establishing routines and cautious progress. Jacob Miller watched from the doorway, nodding approval at Mark's technique. "You've got a natural talent," the blacksmith observed, stroking his beard. "That's the cleanest weld I've seen in months." Mark nodded his thanks, focusing on the horseshoe taking shape beneath his hammer. Miller had been true to his word, offering steady work 3 days a week. The pay was fair, better than Mark had earned in years. "How's the girl settling in?" Miller asked, passing Mark a bucket of water for quenching. "Well enough," Mark replied, submerging the finished horseshoe with a satisfying hiss of steam. "She is resilient," Miller grunted agreement. "Martha saw her at school yesterday. Said she answered every arithmetic question correct." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Martha wondered if you'd allow Ayla to visit our home. For supper, perhaps. Sunday next." Mark's hammer stilled mid-strike. An invitation to a white man's home was unprecedented in his 17 years in Copper Creek. "Why?" he asked bluntly. Miller's weathered face softened. "We had a daughter once, Caroline. Fever took her when she was about Ayla's age." He ran a hand along the anvil's edge. "Martha hasn't been the same since, but she saw Ayla reading by herself at recess yesterday. Said the girl reminded her of our Caroline." Mark studied the blacksmith. Miller had always been fair, treating Mark with gruff respect when others offered only contempt. But this was different. "I will ask Ayla," Mark said finally. "It is her choice." The conversation was interrupted by the forge door swinging open. Ayla stood there, school tablet clutched to her chest, eyes wide as she took in the glowing furnace and tools. "Mrs. Lancaster said I could come straight here today," she explained. "Is that all right?" Mark nodded, suddenly aware of his soot-covered appearance and the dangerous environment. "Stay by the door," he cautioned. "The fire is not safe." But Ayla had already been distracted by something on Miller's workbench, a small iron figurine of a horse, its lines simple but graceful. "Did you make this?" she asked Miller, her voice filled with wonder. The blacksmith nodded. a rare smile cracking his stern facade. Started as a scrap piece, was going to melt it down, but seemed a waste. He picked up the figurine, studying it critically. Not much use to me. Ayla's eyes followed the iron horse longingly as Miller set it back down. Mark recognized the look he'd worn it himself as a child, watching other boys play with toys his family couldn't afford. Miller cleared his throat. Mr. Miller asked if you might like to have supper at his home, Mark said, changing the subject. With Mrs. Miller, Ayla's eyes widened. A real supper, at a table with plates. Miller chuckled, a rusty sound as if rarely used. Martha sets a proper table, sure enough. Makes the best apple pie in the territory too. Can we go? Ayla asked Mark eagerly. Mark noted the we with a warmth that had become increasingly familiar. Yes, he agreed. We can go. Miller nodded, pleased. Sunday then, after church. He hesitated, then added gruffly, you're welcome to join us for the service too if you've a mind. Mark had no interest in the white man's church, with its talk of sin and salvation, but he recognized the significance of the invitation. Thank you, he said carefully, but we will come after. As they prepared to leave later that afternoon, Miller called Ayla back. Almost forgot, he said, pressing something into her small hand. Every smithy apprentice needs inspiration. Ayla opened her palm to reveal the iron horse figurine. For me, she breathed. Miller nodded. Made by fire, strong as the mountains. Reminds me of someone I'm getting to know. Ayla clutched the figurine to her chest. Thank you, Mr. Miller. On the walk home, she couldn't stop talking about their upcoming dinner, the iron horse held carefully in her hand. Do you think Mrs. Miller will like me? Will there be other children? Should I bring my slate to show her my letters? Mark listened, answering when necessary. The invitation represented something significant, a crack in the wall that separated them from the town's life. One family willing to open their door might lead to others. Why did Mr. Miller give me this seed? Ayla asked suddenly, holding up the iron horse. Mark considered the question. Perhaps because he sees your strength. But I'm not strong, she objected. Tommy Crawford still takes my slate at school, and I can't stop him. Mark stopped walking, kneeling to meet her eyes. There are many kinds of strength, Ayla. Enduring when others are cruel takes great strength. Learning when others say you cannot, that is strength too. She studied the iron figurine thoughtfully. Is that why you're strong? Because people were cruel to you? The question pierced Mark with its innocent insight. Perhaps, he acknowledged. But true strength comes from protecting what matters. He gently closed her fingers around the figurine. Remember that evening Mark watched as Ayla arranged the iron horse in her sleeping area, positioning it carefully beside her, drawing on a small shelf he'd fashioned. The simple toys, one created by her own hand, one gifted in kindness, formed the beginning of a collection. A normal child's treasures in what was becoming a normal child's home. The iron horse stood guard as Ayla slept, its solid presence a reminder that even the strongest metals could be shaped by fire into something new. Mark touched the figurine gently, sensing that he and Ayla were being similarly transformed, forged in adversity, stronger for the shaping. The dinner at the Millers had gone surprisingly well. Martha Miller, a thin woman with kind eyes that held lingering sadness, had taken an immediate liking to Ayla. Mark had sat uncomfortably at first, unused to dining at a proper table, but Jacob's easy conversation and Martha's gentle hospitality gradually eased his tension. 3 days later, Mark woke before dawn to the sound of coughing, harsh, deep coughs that sent him bolting to Ayla's sleeping area. He found her curled beneath the woolen blanket, her small body shaking with each ragged breath. Ayla, he touched her forehead and felt the unmistakable heat of fever. My chest hurts, she whispered between coughs. Like Mama's did. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Mark's heart. Sophia had died of consumption, a wasting disease that took many on the frontier. He'd seen its devastating effects in his own tribe years ago. I will get help, he promised, wrapping her more securely in the blanket. He stoked the fire quickly, then hesitated. There was only one doctor in Copper Creek, and Dr. Thompson had made his disdain for Mark clear at every opportunity. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as Mark pounded on the doctor's door. Minutes passed before a window opened above. "Who's there?" Thompson called irritably. "Do you know what time it is?" "The child is sick," Mark said. "Fever, bad cough." The window slammed shut. Mark waited, counting his own heartbeats until the door finally opened. Thompson stood there in his nightshirt, an oil lamp casting harsh shadows across his face. "The Martinez girl?" he asked, already reaching for his medical bag. "Yes, she burns with fever." Thompson's face hardened. "I'll come, but not for you. I treated her mother." The doctor insisted on riding his own horse, refusing to share Mark's mount. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was rising, and Ayla's condition had worsened. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, her nightshirt soaked with sweat. Thompson examined her with clinical efficiency, his initial coldness giving way to professional concern. He listened to her chest with a wooden stethoscope, felt her glands, checked her eyes and tongue. "Pneumonia," he pronounced finally. "Not consumption, thank God, but serious enough. Her lungs are filling with fluid." Mark stood by helplessly. "What can be done?" Thompson reached into his bag and removed a small amber bottle, holding it up to the light. "Quinine tincture. It will help with the fever. For the lungs." He hesitated. "I have limited medicine. I will pay," Mark said quickly. "Whatever it costs." The doctor gave him a measured look. "It's not about payment. These medicines are precious out here. I must use them judiciously." The implication hung in the air that an Indian's ward might not deserve the town's limited medical resources. "She is a child," Mark said, his voice low but intense. "Just a child," Thompson sighed, setting the bottle on the table. "I know, that's why I'm here." He pulled out a second, smaller bottle. "This is from my personal supply. An expectorant to help clear her lungs. 3 drops in water every 4 hours. The doctor provided instructions for keeping Ayla comfortable. Cool cloths for her fever, steam for her breathing, plenty of water." As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "I'll return tomorrow," he said reluctantly. "Keep her warm but not overheated. If the fever worsens, come for me immediately." Mark nodded, already moving to prepare the medicine. The day passed in a blur of worry. Mark administered the medicines precisely as instructed, watching anxiously for any change. By evening, Ayla's fever still raged. During brief moments of lucidity, she asked for water in a weak, scratchy voice that tore at Mark's heart. A knock at the door revealed Sheriff Wilson. "I heard the girl's sick," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "Thompson mentioned it in town." Mark nodded, too exhausted for words. "My wife sent this," Wilson continued, holding out a jar of honey. "Says it helps soothe the throat, and Martha Miller's on her way with some chicken broth." Before Mark could respond, Martha herself arrived, a covered pot in her hands. "Jacob's closing the forge early," she announced, brushing past both men to assess the situation herself. With practiced efficiency, she set about making Ayla more comfortable, showing Mark how to prop her up to ease her breathing. The amber medicine bottle sat on the table like a sentinel, its contents precious and dwindling. Mark measured each dose with painstaking care, terrified of wasting even a single drop. Night fell, bringing no improvement. Mark refused to leave Ayla's side, even as Martha and Jacob insisted he rest. Sometime past midnight, in the darkest hours, Ayla's fever peaked. She thrashed beneath the blankets, calling for her mother in a voice raw from coughing. Mark held her hand, speaking softly in Apache, the prayers and healing songs of his childhood rising unbidden to his lips. He wasn't sure if he believed in their power anymore, but they were all he had to offer, besides the medicine. Dawn broke with Ayla still burning with fever. The medicine bottle was now half empty, its amber contents catching the early light. Mark stared at it, willing it to be enough to save this child who had somehow become the center of his world. Thompson returned as promised, his face betraying surprise at finding Martha Miller asleep in a chair, while Mark continued his vigil. "You've been up all night?" he asked, checking Ayla's pulse. Mark nodded, holding up the medicine bottle. I followed your instructions exactly. Thompson examined Ayla thoroughly, his expression giving nothing away. Finally, he straightened. The fever hasn't broken yet, but her lungs sound slightly clearer. He reached for the bottle, measuring its remaining contents. Continue as before. I'll bring more medicine this evening. As the doctor prepared to leave, Mark walked him to the door. Thank you, he said quietly. Thompson paused, studying Mark with new consideration. You know, he said finally, most men would have given up by now, decided it was God's will or some such. Mark looked back at Ayla. She is stronger than she appears. She will fight, if given the chance. The medicine bottle gleamed on the table, a beacon of hope in the dim cabin. Mark returned to Ayla's side, determined that while a single drop remained, they would continue the battle together. 3 days of fevered delirium passed before Ayla's temperature finally broke. Mark had dozed off in the chair beside her bed when a small voice woke him. I'm hungry, Ayla whispered, her eyes clear for the first time in days. Relief washed over Mark like a summer rain. I will make you soup, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. Recovery came slowly. A week passed before Ayla could sit up comfortably, another before she could walk around the cabin without tiring. During this time, a steady stream of visitors surprised Mark. Martha Miller, bringing fresh bread, Sheriff Wilson's wife, with preserved fruit, even Mrs. Lancaster, with books for Ayla to read while confined to bed. People were worried about her, Miss Lancaster explained one afternoon as Ayla napped. The whole school made her get-well cards. Mark studied the pile of childish drawings with amazement. Even Tommy Crawford, Mrs. Lancaster smiled wryly. His was the smallest. But yes, even Tommy. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Lancaster paused. Do you know what day is coming next week? Mark looked at her blankly. April 18th, she prompted. When he still showed no recognition, she sighed. It's Ayla's birthday. She'll be 9 years old. The information startled Mark. Among his people, the changing of seasons marked the passage of time, not specific calendar dates. The concept of celebrating the exact day of birth was foreign to him. How do you know this? He asked. Sophia registered Ayla's birth in the town records, Mrs. Lancaster explained. 9 years ago next Thursday. After she left, Mark sat thinking. In his tribe, children received special recognition when they mastered important skills or showed particular courage. Ayla had certainly demonstrated both. And after her illness, a celebration seemed fitting. The next day, while Ayla was strong enough to sit outside in the spring sunshine, Mark visited Miller's forge. A birthday, the blacksmith mused when Mark explained his dilemma. Martha would know more about such things, but I recall Caroline always had a special meal and a small gift. He looked up from his work. Does Ayla like sweet things? Martha makes molasses cookies that could tempt an angel. Mark nodded, grateful for the suggestion. And a gift? He had little money, despite the steady work at the forge. Miller considered this. Doesn't need to be fancy, something meaningful. Something you made yourself, maybe. That evening, after Ayla was asleep, Mark retrieved a piece of pine wood he'd been saving. By firelight he began to carve, his knife moving with practiced precision. Night after night he worked in secret, hiding the project whenever Ayla stirred. 3 days before her birthday, Mark approached Martha Miller with his plans. Her face lit up with enthusiasm. A party? Oh, Jacob and I would be delighted to help. We could have it here if you like. More room than your cabin. Her eyes grew misty. Caroline's last birthday, we had 3 other children attend. It was lovely. Mark hesitated. Who would come to Ayla's party? Martha considered this carefully. Jenny from school seems fond of her, and the Cooper twins don't follow their father's prejudices. I could speak with their mothers. On the morning of April 18th, Mark placed a small wrapped package at the foot of Ayla's bed before she woke. He'd used a page from her drawing tablet as wrapping paper, carefully folding it around his creation. What's this? Ayla asked sleepily, as she discovered the package. For your birthday, Mark explained. 9 years today. Her eyes widened. "You remembered my birthday?" "Mrs. Lancaster told me," he admitted. "Open it." With careful fingers, Ayla unwrapped the paper to reveal a wooden horse, intricately carved to echo the iron figurine Miller had given her. Unlike the metal version's static pose, this one had its head turned slightly, mane flowing as if in motion. "You made this," she whispered, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Mark nodded. "There is more. Mrs. Miller has invited us for a party." Ayla's face transformed with joy. "A real birthday party. With other children." "3 others," Mark confirmed. "And cake." The Miller home was transformed when they arrived that afternoon. Paper decorations hung from the ceiling, and the table was set with Martha's best dishes. Jenny from school arrived with her mother, followed by the Cooper twins, 2 quiet boys who presented Ayla with crude but earnest drawings. Martha brought out a small cake with 9 candles. "Make a wish," she instructed, as Ayla prepared to blow them out. Ayla closed her eyes tightly, her face scrunched in concentration, then blew with all her might. Everyone applauded as the last flame flickered out. "What did you wish for?" Jenny asked eagerly. "Can't tell," Ayla replied seriously, "or it won't come true." The afternoon passed in games and laughter. Mark sat somewhat apart, watching Ayla's happiness with quiet satisfaction. Jacob joined him, passing a cup of coffee. "She looks like she belongs," the blacksmith observed. Mark nodded, his eyes never leaving Ayla as she played tag with the other children in the miller's small yard. The wooden horse sat on the table among her other gifts: a hair ribbon from Martha, a small book from Mrs. Lancaster, colorful marbles from the Cooper boys, and a bracelet of woven thread from Jenny. Sheriff Wilson appeared briefly, ostensibly to speak with Jacob about shoeing his horse, but he brought a small bag of peppermint sticks that delighted all the children. "Quite the turnaround," he commented to Mark. "Month ago, nobody would have let their kids near her. Now look." As the party wound down and the other children left, Ayla sat on the miller's porch steps, carefully arranging her gifts. The wooden horse took center place, its carved form catching the late afternoon light. "Was your wish a good one?" Mark asked, sitting beside her. Ayla nodded solemnly. "The best wish ever. Better than a pony or a big house," he teased gently. She looked up at him, suddenly serious. "That you could be my father forever. For real." Mark's breath caught. Among his people, adoption was sacred, a way of rebuilding families shattered by war or disease. He had not dared to think beyond the temporary guardianship granted by the town council. "That is a big wish," he said finally. Ayla clutched the wooden horse to her chest. "But not impossible, right?" Mark thought of the town council meeting scheduled for the following week, where his guardianship would be reviewed, of Crawford's continuing opposition, of the legal barriers facing an Apache man seeking to adopt a white child. "Not impossible," he agreed, though the path seemed fraught with obstacles. That night, as Ayla slept, surrounded by her birthday treasures, Mark stood watching her peaceful face. The wooden horse rested in her hand, already becoming worn from constant touching. In carving it, he had worked from memory, not just of the iron figurine, but of the horses that had once been the lifeblood of his tribe, horses that symbolized freedom, strength, and the unbreakable bond between rider and mount. Family. The morning of the town council meeting arrived clear and bright, belying Mark's uneasiness. He and Ayla walked to town together, her hand tucked trustingly in his. The wooden horse rested in her pocket, a talisman she'd carried since her birthday. "Will they let me stay with you forever today?" Ayla asked, as they approached the town hall. "Perhaps," Mark answered carefully. "We must be patient." The meeting room was already crowded when they entered. Mark noted with surprise that Jacob and Martha Miller were present, along with Mrs. Lancaster and even Dr. Thompson. Thomas Crawford sat at the council table beside Mayor Simmons, his expression cold. "Mark 2 Rivers." The mayor began formally once everyone was seated. "It's been 1 month since this council granted you temporary guardianship of Ayla Martinez. We're here to review that arrangement and determine if it should continue." Crawford immediately leaned forward. "Before we waste time on this charade, There's another matter that takes precedence. He withdrew a document from his coat pocket. I've discovered that the land where Mr. Rivers has built his cabin is actually part of the Crawford Ranch holdings. I have the deed right here. A murmur rippled through the room. Sheriff Wilson frowned. That land was unclaimed when Mark settled there. Everyone knows that. Apparently not, Crawford replied smoothly, sliding the document toward Judge Harmon. As you can see, my father purchased that parcel in '53. It's been Crawford land for 20 years. The judge examined the yellowed paper, his expression grave. This appears to be in order, a proper deed correctly recorded. Mark felt Ayla's hand tighten in his. The implications were clear. If he had no legal right to the land, his precarious position became even more tenuous. What does this have to do with Ayla's guardianship? Mrs. Lancaster demanded. Crawford smiled thinly. Simply that a man with no legal residence is hardly a suitable guardian for a child. I'm not asking that he be removed immediately. He'll have 2 weeks to vacate my property. Jacob Miller stood, his large frame imposing. Where's he supposed to go? That cabin's been his home for 17 years. That's hardly my concern, Crawford replied. The law is the law. Ayla's small voice cut through the rising tension. You just want to make Mark leave because you don't want me living with him. Crawford's smile vanished. Young lady, this is a matter for adults. Is it true? She persisted. Are you making us leave because you don't want people knowing I'm your niece? A shocked silence fell over the room. Crawford's face drained of color, then flushed dark red. What ridiculous nonsense. Sophia told me before she died, Mrs. Lancaster interjected quietly. James Crawford was Ayla's father. Your brother, Tom. All eyes turned to Crawford, whose outrage seemed to choke him momentarily speechless. This is slander, he finally managed. My brother would never. He was engaged to Catherine Ballard from Santa Fe. Yes, Mrs. Lancaster agreed sadly. That didn't stop him from visiting Sophia regularly for nearly a year before his death. Judge Harmon cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should return to the matter at hand. This is the matter at hand, Martha Miller exclaimed. Crawford wants to separate them because he's ashamed of his own blood. Crawford slammed his fist on the table. I want them separated because it's unnatural. An Apache raising a white child, half Mexican, Dr. Thompson corrected mildly. And possibly quarter Apache if your brother's taste ran in that direction as well. The room erupted in shocked exclamations. Mark remained silent, feeling Ayla trembling beside him. He placed a protective hand on her shoulder. Enough, Mayor Simmons shouted, restoring order. This meeting will be conducted with civility. He turned to Mark. Mr. Rivers, are you aware of this deed Mr. Crawford has presented? Mark shook his head. I settled that land when no one wanted it. Built my cabin with my own hands. No one claimed it then. Judge Harmon examined the deed more closely. Interesting. This document indicates the property was part of a larger purchase, but the boundaries are imprecise. He looked up. Mr. Crawford, do you have the original survey maps? Crawford shifted uncomfortably. They would be in my father's papers. I'd need time to locate them. Convenient, Sheriff Wilson muttered. The judge made a note. I'll need to see those maps before making any determination about the property rights. He set the deed aside. In the meantime, we should address the guardianship issue. Crawford wasn't finished. Even if you ignore the property question, there's still the matter of propriety. A single man raising a young girl. Mark took care of Ayla through pneumonia. Dr. Thompson interrupted. Stayed awake for 3 days straight. Followed my instructions perfectly. Never left her side. The doctor straightened his spectacles. In 20 years of practice, I've rarely seen such dedicated care from any parent, blood or otherwise. Mrs. Lancaster nodded agreement, and Ayla's thriving in school. Reading above her grade level already. One by one, others spoke in Mark's favor. Jacob and Martha Miller, Sheriff Wilson, even Henderson from the general store. Crawford's face grew darker with each testimonial. When everyone had spoken, Judge Harmon turned to Mark. Do you wish to continue as Ayla's guardian, Mr. Rivers? Yes, Mark said simply. And you, young lady, do you wish to remain with Mr. Rivers? Ayla stood, her chin raised despite her nervousness. I want Mark to be my father, she said clearly. For real and forever. The judge's eyebrows rose. That's a more significant legal step than guardianship. I understand, Mark said. Among my people, to adopt an orphaned child is sacred. I am prepared for this responsibility. Judge Harmon nodded thoughtfully. I'll need time to consider both the property dispute and the guardianship question. Until then, the current arrangement stands. He fixed Crawford with a stern look. No eviction proceedings until the deed is verified with proper survey maps. As they left the meeting, Sheriff Wilson fell into step beside them. Crawford won't give up easily, he warned. That deed looked mighty convenient to me, showing up right when he needs leverage. Mark nodded, understanding the implication. The land matters less than Ayla. True, Wilson agreed, but without the land your position is weaker. He lowered his voice. If I were you, I'd start looking for those original survey maps myself. Court records in Santa Fe might have copies. That night after Ayla was asleep, Mark unfolded the deed Crawford had presented. Sheriff Wilson had obtained a copy for him to examine. The faded ink and legal language were difficult to decipher. But one thing was clear. If this document was valid, he and Ayla could lose everything they had built together. The yellowed paper seemed to mock him, a reminder that in the white man's world, written documents held more power than 17 years of living on and working the land. This deed, this single sheet of paper, threatened to destroy not just his home but his chance at the family he had begun to rebuild from the ashes of his past. We're going to Santa Fe. Ayla's eyes widened with excitement as Mark explained their journey. On the stagecoach, Khan and Mark nodded, continuing to pack their small travel bag. Sheriff Wilson had arranged everything: 2 tickets on tomorrow's stage, a letter of introduction to the territorial records clerk, and lodging with his cousin who kept a boarding house. It is a long journey, Mark cautioned. 2 days of hard travel. Ayla was undeterred. I've never been anywhere but Copper Creek. She carefully placed her wooden horse in the bag. Will we find the maps that prove our home is really ours? Mark wished he shared her confidence. We will search for the truth. The stagecoach departed at dawn, rattling and swaying along rutted trails. Mark sat stiffly, uncomfortable in the confined space, with 4 other passengers who cast occasional curious glances at the unusual pair. An Apache man and a young girl, clearly not his biological child. By midday, Ayla had charmed their fellow travelers with her reading ability, proudly demonstrating by reciting from Mrs. Lancaster's worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress that she'd brought for the journey. Remarkable child, commented an elderly woman in a black bombazine dress. You must be very proud, sir. Mark nodded, surprised by the easy assumption that he was Ayla's father. Outside of Copper Creek, perhaps their relationship seemed less extraordinary. They arrived in Santa Fe late the following day, dusty and exhausted. Sheriff Wilson's cousin, Miss Farnsworth, welcomed them with minimal fuss, showing them to a small but clean room with 2 narrow beds. Bathrooms down the hall, she explained. Breakfast at 7 sharp. Sheriff said you've got business at the territorial offices. Yes, Mark confirmed. Property records. Mrs. Farnsworth nodded knowingly. Land disputes are common these days, especially with the old Spanish grants and Indian claims getting sorted out. She gave Ayla a sympathetic look. Rest well, child. Your father's got a battle ahead with those clerks. Again, the assumption of fatherhood passed without correction. Mark found he didn't mind. The Territorial Records Office was housed in an imposing adobe building near the plaza. Inside, narrow hallways led to rooms filled with shelves of leather-bound books and document boxes. The clerk, a thin man named Alvarez, studied Sheriff Wilson's letter with raised eyebrows. Crawford Ranch boundaries. That's a large holding. He looked at Mark skeptically. What's your interest in this matter? Mark explained the situation as concisely as possible. Alvarez listened, then sighed. The original survey maps would be filed with the initial land grant or purchase. He gestured to the overwhelming array of shelves. We'll need to look through the records from the early 1850s. What followed was hours of painstaking search through dusty documents. Ela helped by organizing papers as they worked, showing unexpected patience for a child her age. Near day's end, Alvarez pulled a large leather portfolio from a bottom shelf. Crawford Acquisitions, 1853, he announced. This should contain what you're looking for. Inside were several documents, deeds, bills of sale, and finally a large folded map. Alvarez spread it carefully on the table, weighing the corners with small stones. Here, he said, pointing to a section marked with the Crawford name. This shows the original boundaries purchased from the Mendoza family. Mark studied the map intently, tracing the landmarks with his finger. The creek, the rock formation shaped like a bear. He looked up, eyes bright with realization. My cabin is here, he said, pointing to a spot, clearly outside the Crawford boundaries. Alvarez nodded slowly. According to this original survey, yes. Your land appears to be part of what was then unclaimed territorial property. He frowned. You said Crawford presented a deed showing ownership of your parcel. Yes. Different boundaries from these. Interesting. Alvarez carefully examined the map again. This is the official survey from 1853. If Crawford has a document showing different boundaries, one of them isn't authentic. Mark felt a surge of hope. Can I have a copy of this map? Better. Alvarez reached into a drawer and removed a blank sheet of heavy paper. I can create a certified copy with the territorial seal. That will stand up in court. As Alvarez meticulously traced the map, Isla explored the room, examining the various documents with curious eyes. Mark watched her open a large book of newspaper clippings, carefully turning the fragile pages. Suddenly she gasped. Mark, look! He crossed to her side, where she pointed to a faded newspaper article. The headline read, Tragic Accident Claims Lives of Army Captain and Apache Leaders. With growing disbelief, Mark read the article describing a misunderstanding during peace negotiations 17 years earlier. According to the account, a young lieutenant named Thomas Crawford had accidentally discharged his weapon, triggering a chaotic exchange of gunfire that left several dead, including Apache medicine man 2 Hawks. Mark's father, the article praised Lieutenant Crawford for restoring order and preventing further bloodshed, portraying him as a hero who had salvaged a disastrous situation. Mark stared at the yellowed clipping, memories flooding back, the gunshots, the screams, his frantic ride back to the camp, arriving too late to save anyone. There had been no accident, no misunderstanding. He had witnessed the aftermath, the methodical execution of bound prisoners. Mark Ayler's voice broke through his shock. Are you all right? You look strange. He forced himself to breathe, to focus on her concerned face, rather than the horrific images from his past. I am surprised, he managed. This tells of my family's death. Alvarez looked up sharply. You're connected to this incident. 2 Hawks was my father, Mark said quietly. The clerk's expression shifted to one of awkward sympathy. I've heard different accounts of what happened that day. He hesitated. There are other documents regarding that incident. Military reports, witness statements. He lowered his voice. Not all align with the newspaper's version. I would like to see them, Mark said. Alvarez glanced meaningfully at Ela. Perhaps not with the child present. Understanding, Mark asked Ela to wait in the outer office. Once she was gone, Alvarez retrieved a slim folder from a locked cabinet. These are copies of the official investigation, he explained, including testimony that was omitted from the final report. Among the papers was a faded photograph. Officers posed stiffly before an army tent. A young Thomas Crawford stood at the center, his face unmistakable though 2 decades younger. Mark studied the photograph, memorizing every detail. Here was proof, tangible evidence of Crawford's involvement in the massacre that had destroyed his family and sent him into exile. Here was the true reason for Crawford's determination to drive him away from Copper Creek. It wasn't just about Ayla, it was about silencing a living witness to his crime. The territorial courthouse in Copper Creek was rarely used, a stark wooden building reserved for the circuit judge's monthly visits. Today, however, it was filled to capacity. Word of the confrontation between Mark II Rivers and Thomas Crawford had spread through town like wildfire, drawing spectators from miles around. Mark sat beside Jacob Miller at the plaintiff's table, his face impassive despite the tension coursing through him. Across the aisle, Crawford whispered urgently to his lawyer, a slick-looking man, brought in from Santa Fe. Behind Mark sat Ayla, nestled protectively between Martha Miller and Mrs. Lancaster. Judge Harmon entered, his black robes billowing as he took his seat. The heavy wooden gavel in his hand commanded immediate silence as he brought it down with practiced authority. "This court will come to order," he announced. "We are here to resolve two connected matters, the property dispute between Thomas Crawford and Mark II Rivers, and the petition for permanent guardianship of the minor child, Ayla Martinez." Crawford's lawyer rose immediately. "Your Honor, I move that these matters be considered separately. The property dispute is a simple legal question of deed validity, while the guardianship issue involves complex considerations of the child's welfare." Miller's hand gripped Mark's arm in warning, but Mark remained still. The lawyer Miller had found for him, a young, earnest man named Phillips, stood. "Your Honor, these matters are inextricably linked. Mr. Crawford's sudden claim to my client's land came only after Mr. Rivers sought permanent guardianship of Ayla Martinez. We intend to demonstrate that the property claim is not only invalid, but maliciously motivated." Judge Harmon considered both arguments. "I'm inclined to hear all evidence before ruling on either matter. Let's begin with the property dispute. Mr. Crawford, as plaintiff, you may present your case." Crawford took the stand, painting a picture of recent discovery, finding his father's papers, realizing the cabin encroached on Crawford land, bringing the matter forward as any law-abiding citizen would. "And why didn't you raise this issue during the 17 years Mr. Rivers has lived there?" Phillips asked during cross-examination. Crawford shrugged. "I had no reason to review those particular boundaries until recently. The land seemed worthless, just a rocky patch near the creek. Until Mr. Rivers sought to adopt Ayla Martinez," Phillips pressed. "Then suddenly this worthless land became worth fighting for." "Objection," Crawford's lawyer called. "Counsel is implying improper motive without foundation." "Sustained," Judge Harmon ruled. "Mr. Phillips, confine yourself to facts, not implications." The certified map from Santa Fe was entered into evidence, with Alvarez testifying via sworn affidavit to its authenticity. Crawford's lawyer argued that subsequent adjustments to the property line might not be reflected in the original survey. By midday, the legal arguments had grown technical and tedious. Judge Harmon called a recess, and Mark stepped outside for air, finding Sheriff Wilson waiting. "You're doing well," the sheriff encouraged. "Crawford looks nervous." Mark nodded, his mind not on the property dispute, but on the photograph secured in his pocket, evidence of Crawford's role in his family's massacre. He had not yet decided whether to reveal it. As the court reconvened, Miss Lancaster took the stand to testify about Ayla's progress in school and her thriving under Mark's care. Dr. Thompson followed, describing Mark's dedication during Ayla's illness. "In your professional opinion," Phillips asked, "is Mr. Rivers a suitable guardian for Ayla?" The doctor adjusted his spectacles. "In terms of care and commitment, unquestionably. I've seen natural parents show less devotion." Crawford's lawyer focused his questions on cultural differences. "Wouldn't the child benefit from being raised in her own culture, with Christian values and traditions?" "Her mother chose Mr. Rivers as guardian," Dr. Thompson replied evenly. "I respect Sophia Martinez's judgment in this matter." Finally, Judge Harmon called Ayla herself to speak. She approached the witness chair with trepidation, her small frame nearly swallowed by the massive wooden seat. The judge smiled kindly, removing his intimidating spectacles. "Now, Ayla, I just want to ask you a few simple questions. You don't need to be scared." She nodded, her eyes finding marks for reassurance. "Are you happy living with Mr. Rivers?" "Yes, sir," she answered clearly. "He takes good care of me. And do you understand what adoption means? That Mr. Rivers would legally become your father? It means we'd be a real family," Ayla said, "and nobody could take me away. Is that what you want?" "More than anything," she replied without hesitation. Crawford's lawyer stood for cross-examination. "Ayla, wouldn't you like to live in a nice big house, with pretty dresses and other children to play with?" Ayla considered the question seriously. "Our cabin is nice, and Mark is teaching me to ride at Mr. Miller's farm." She straightened in the chair. "And I already have a father. He just needs the paper to make it official." When Ayla returned to her seat, Judge Harmon announced, "I'll hear closing arguments, then render my decision." Crawford's lawyer emphasized legal precedent, property rights, and the natural order of cultural heritage. Phillips countered with evidence of the falsified deed and the community's support for Mark's guardianship. As the arguments concluded, Judge Harmon lifted his gavel, its polished wood gleaming in the afternoon light. The entire courtroom held its breath, awaiting the strike that would determine Mark and Ayla's fate. "Before I rule," the judge said unexpectedly, "Mr. Rivers, do you wish to address the court?" Mark rose slowly, feeling the weight of the photograph in his pocket. He could expose Crawford now, reveal his role in the massacre, publicly shame him before the community that respected him. Yet, as he looked at Ayla's hopeful face, Mark understood that vengeance would solve nothing. What mattered was their future, not his past. "I wish only to provide a home and family for Ayla," he said simply, "as her mother intended, as Ayla herself wishes, as I have promised to do." Judge Harmon nodded, then raised his gavel high. "Having considered all evidence and testimony, this court finds the Crawford deed to be inconsistent with the original survey maps, and therefore invalid." The gavel struck with finality. Mr. Rivers' claim to his homestead is upheld. A murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom. Furthermore, the judge continued, regarding the matter of guardianship, "This court finds Mark II. Rivers to be a fit and proper guardian for Ayla Martinez. The petition for permanent guardianship is granted, with adoption proceedings to follow if Mr. Rivers so chooses." The gavel struck again, sealing their victory. As cheers erupted around them, Ayla launched herself into Mark's arms. Over her head, he caught Crawford's venomous glare, a look that promised this was not over. The photograph remained in Mark's pocket, unused but not forgotten. Some truths could wait for another day. The celebration at Miller's Forge lasted well into evening. The blacksmith had closed his shop early, inviting friends to mark Mark and Ayla's victory with food and conversation. Even Sheriff Wilson attended briefly, tipping his hat to Mark before departing for his nightly rounds. "You should stay in town tonight," Martha suggested, as the gathering wound down. "It's getting late, and the road home is dark." Mark shook his head. "We have animals to tend," he explained. Though the truth was simpler, after weeks of tension he longed for the peace of their own home. The night air carried autumn's first chill as they walked the familiar path to their cabin. Ayla skipped ahead, exhilarated by the day's events and the unusual freedom of being out after dark. "Can I start calling you father now?" she asked, turning to walk backward while facing him. Since the judge said it's allowed, something warm bloomed in Mark's chest. "If you wish, I do wish," she said firmly. "I've been practicing it in my head for weeks." As they crested the final hill, Mark stopped abruptly. Something was wrong. Though darkness shrouded their cabin, his instincts, honed by years of survival, sensed a danger. "Ayla," he said quietly, "go back to the Millers." She froze, immediately alert to the tension in his voice. "What's wrong?" "Go now," he insisted. "Run. Don't stop until you reach town." "I won't leave you," she protested. A twig snapped in the darkness to their right. Mark pushed Ayla behind him, just as the first shot cracked through the night. The bullet splintered bark from a tree inches from his head. "Run," Mark shouted, shoving Ayla toward town. 3 men emerged from the shadows, rifles raised. Mark recognized Crawford's ranch hands. Dunn, a scarred man with cold eyes. Martinez, ironically sharing Ayla's surname, though nothing of her spirit, and young Fletcher, barely 20 but already hardened by frontier violence. Crawford sends his regards. Dunn drawls, says, "If the law won't remove you, we will." Mark calculated his chances. Unarmed against 3 rifles in open ground, his only advantage was intimate knowledge of the terrain. "This land is legally mine," he said, playing for time while listening for Ayla's retreating footsteps. To his dismay, he heard nothing. She hadn't fled. "Legal don't matter out here," Martinez spat. "What matters is Mr. Crawford wants you gone one way or another." A small sound, almost imperceptible, came from the bushes to Mark's left. Ayla was hiding, not running. Fear for her safety sharpened his senses. "I will not leave," Mark stated, deliberately drawing their attention while moving subtly away from Ayla's hiding place. "Tell Crawford to face me himself if he wants me gone." Dunn's laugh was ugly. "He don't dirty his hands with Indian problems. That's what we're for." The men spread out, forming a loose semicircle around Mark. He backed slowly toward a stand of trees, leading them away from where he believed Ayla was hiding. "We're gonna burn that cabin to the ground," Fletcher announced, his young voice eager for violence. "With or without you inside it." Mark's back hit a tree trunk. 20 feet to the right lay a steep embankment leading down to the creek. A possible escape route, but one that would leave Ayla unprotected. "The girl's not here," Martinez observed, looking around. "Shame." Crawford said to take care of both problems at once. Rage surged through Mark at the casual threat to Ayla, momentarily overwhelming his caution. "If you touch her, you'll what, Apache?" Dunn raised his rifle. "You'll be dead." A rock suddenly flew from the bushes, striking Fletcher squarely in the temple. The young man yelped in pain, firing his rifle instinctively into the air. "There she is," Martinez shouted, swinging his weapon toward the source of the projectile. Mark seized the moment of distraction, launching himself at Dunn. They crashed to the ground, wrestling for control of the rifle. A shot discharged into the dirt. Mark slammed his elbow into Dunn's throat, momentarily stunning him. "Run, Ayla," he shouted, rolling away with Dunn's rifle. Martinez fired toward the bushes. The muzzle flash illuminated the night, revealing Ayla's small form darting between trees. The bullet shattered a low branch above her head, raining splinters down on her. Mark raised the captured rifle and fired at Martinez, forcing him to dive for cover. Fletcher had recovered and was now circling to Mark's left, trying to flank him. "Get the girl," Dunn rasped, struggling to his feet. "Crawford wants them both gone." Mark fired again, the shot going wide but buying precious seconds. "Ayla, the creek path," he called, directing her toward their emergency route, a hidden trail along the water that led to town. He glimpsed her white dress, disappearing into the darkness toward the creek, and felt momentary relief until a crash and terrified scream reached his ears. Ayla had fallen. Abandoning caution, Mark raced toward the sound, drawing fire from all 3 men. Pain exploded along his left arm as a bullet grazed him, but he didn't slow. He found Ayla at the creek's edge, her dress caught on broken branches, her face contorted with pain and fear. Behind them, flashlights bobbed as the men closed in. "My ankle," she gasped. "I can't walk." Mark scooped her up with his good arm, the rifle awkward but still gripped in his wounded one. Blood dripped from his elbow as he carried her into the shallow creek, following the waterway to mask their trail. A shillard of bullets peppered the water around them. Mark hunched over Ayla, shielding her with his body as he pushed forward through the cold current. Her arms locked around his neck, her face buried against his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have run when you said—" "Hush now," he replied, moving steadily downstream where the creek bent eastward toward town. Voices and flashlights spread out on both banks as Crawford's men pursued them. Mark ducked beneath a low-hanging willow, holding Ayla close as light swept past their hiding place. In the momentary stillness, Ayla's fingers touched his bleeding arm. "You're hurt," she whispered. "It is nothing," he assured her, though the wound burned fiercely. The crack of breaking glass echoed from the direction of their cabin, followed by the unmistakable whoosh of flames catching. Through a gap in the trees, Mark saw the orange glow of fire blooming against the night sky. Their home was burning. Ayla saw it too. Her small hand found his in the darkness, fingers closing around the single window pane that had shattered during the attack, a jagged piece of glass she had retrieved during their flight. In the faint moonlight, the broken glass reflected the distant flames of their burning home, crystallizing their loss into a single sharp fragment. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady despite her fear. Mark drew her closer, mindful of the glass she held, a remnant of the home they had shared, now transformed into both a reminder of what they'd lost and a symbol of what remained unbroken between them. "We survive," he promised. Together, dawn broke over Copper Creek with tongues of gossip spreading faster than the flames had consumed Mark's cabin. Mark sat on a chair in Miller's kitchen, stoically enduring Martha's ministrations to his wounded arm, while Ayla slept in the spare bedroom, exhausted from their night of terror. "Need stitches," Martha pronounced, threading a needle. "Jacob's gone for the doctor, but I can start cleaning it properly." Sheriff Wilson paced the small kitchen, his face thunderous. "And you're certain it was Crawford's men?" "Yes," Mark confirmed. "Dunn, Martinez and Fletcher." "Fletcher's in the jail now," Wilson said grimly. "Found him passed out drunk at the saloon, bragging about running off the Apache. The others have disappeared." He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the dishes. "Crawford's gone too far this time. Attempted murder, arson, these are hanging offenses." Jacob burst through the door, Dr. Thompson close behind. "The whole town's talking," the blacksmith reported. "Crawford's holed up at his ranch, sent his men to block the road." The doctor immediately took over from Martha, examining Mark's wound with professional detachment. "Clean shot through the muscle." "You're fortunate." He began stitching efficiently. "How's the girl?" "Sprained ankle," Martha replied. "No other injuries, thank the Lord." Marla's voice came from the doorway, where she stood balanced on one foot, her other ankle wrapped in bandages. "Is our home really gone?" Mark met her eyes steadily. "The cabin is gone. Our home is wherever we are together." Sheriff Wilson crouched to Ayla's level. "I need to ask you some mimmons about last night, Miss Ayla. Think you're up to telling me what happened?" Ayla nodded solemnly. She recounted the attack with surprising clarity. The men's threats, their admission that Crawford had sent them, their intention to harm both her and Mark. "They said Mr. Crawford wanted both problems taken care of at once," she quoted, her young voice somehow making the words more chilling. Wilson stood, adjusting his gun belt with grim purpose. "That's witness testimony from a child. No judge in the territory would ignore it. If you can arrest Crawford," Jacob pointed out, "his ranch is like a fortress, and he has a dozen men working for him." The doctor finished bandaging Mark's arm. "There's more." Mark looked at him sharply. "I overheard Dunn in the saloon last week before he realized I was there. He was talking about the old incident with Crawford, something about Apache prisoners 17 years ago." Mark's breath caught. The massacre. Crawford was boasting that no one would ever believe an Indian's word against his. Thompson continued. That he'd buried that story along with the bodies. A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. Mark felt the weight of the photograph still hidden in his coat, proof of Crawford's involvement that he had chosen not to use. "What does that mean?" Ayla asked, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Before Mark could answer, commotion erupted outside. Jacob moved to the window. "There's a crowd gathering in the street," he reported. Sheriff Wilson stepped onto the porch, the others following. Nearly half the town had assembled, their faces showing a mix of concern and determination. Mayor Simmons stood at the front, clutching a piece of paper. "Sheriff," the mayor called, "we've drawn up a petition. Wilson descended the steps, taking the offered document. Mark watched from the porch, Ayla leaning against him for support. "What's this?" the sheriff asked, scanning the paper. "A town petition," Mayor Simmons explained. "Every business owner and most households have signed. We demand Crawford's arrest for the attack on Mark Rivers and the child." Mark blinked in surprise. The same townspeople who had once crossed the street to avoid him were now calling for justice on his behalf. "Crawford's powerful," Wilson cautioned. "He won't come quietly." "Then don't go alone," Jacob called from the porch. He held up his shotgun. "I'll stand with you." One by one, men stepped forward. Henderson from the general store, Cooper the carpenter, even Dr. Thompson. "Crawford's terrorized this town long enough," Henderson declared, "using his money and influence to bully anyone who stands against him." Mayor Simmons unfolded the petition further, revealing dozens of signatures that covered both sides of the page. "This isn't just about last night," he explained. "This is about years of Crawford running roughshod over decent folks." He pointed to the document. "We've included accounts of Crawford's past intimidation, threats, and corrupt dealings. Judge Harmon will see this isn't an isolated incident." Mark descended the steps slowly, his wounded arm throbbing. He took the petition, eyes moving over the signatures, some belonging to people who had once shunned him, others to recent allies, all united in common cause. Martha's name was there. Mrs. Lancaster's, the Cooper family, the Wilson, even Henderson and his wife, who had been among the first to dismiss Mark from employment when Ayla came to live with him. "Why?" Mark asked simply, looking up at the gathered townsfolk. Mrs. Lancaster stepped forward. "Because you're one of us now," she said. "You and Ayla both, and we protect our own," Jacob added firmly. The petition passed from hand to hand as others stepped forward to add their names. Mark watched in silence, the weight of acceptance settling over him like a mantle. For 17 years he had lived in Copper Creek as an outsider, tolerated but never welcomed. Now, through his care for an orphaned child, he had found something he lost forever: community. The petition, covered now in signatures both elegant and barely legible, returned to Sheriff Wilson's hands. He folded it carefully, tucking it into his vest pocket. "I'll gather a proper posse," he announced. "We'll ride to Crawford's ranch at noon. This ends today." As the crowd dispersed to prepare, Ayla tugged at Mark's hand. "See?" she whispered. "I told you we'd be a real family. I just didn't know how big our family would be." Mark looked at the town petition, disappearing into the sheriff's pocket, a simple piece of paper transformed into something powerful through the collective will of ordinary people. Paper could burn, like their cabin. Signatures could fade, like memory, but the bonds they represented could endure, stronger than hatred, more resilient than fear. "Yes," he agreed, watching the townsfolk disperse with new purpose. A very big family indeed. Crawford's arrest came without the bloodshed many had feared. Faced with a dozen determined men and Sheriff Wilson's unwavering stance, the rancher had surrendered, with cold dignity, his eyes burning with hatred as he was led past Mark and Ayla watching from the miller's porch. "This isn't over, Apache," he'd hissed. Not by a long shot, but it was over, at least legally. Judge Harmon had returned for a special hearing, reviewing the town petition and witness testimonies. Crawford was bound over for trial in Santa Fe, charged with attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy. Evidence of his role in the long-ago massacre was also being investigated, though those events had occurred in another jurisdiction. A week after Crawford's arrest, Mark stood at the charred remains of their cabin, Ayla beside him on her healing ankle. Little remained: blackened logs, melted metal, ash where their possessions had been. "We could build it bigger this time," Ayla suggested, her resilience humbling Mark. "With 2 proper rooms." Mark nodded, mentally calculating the work involved. The cabin had taken him months to build alone. Winter was approaching. They would need shelter before the first snow. "Mark!" "Ayla!" Jacob Miller's voice called from the trail. The blacksmith appeared, leading a wagon filled with lumber. Behind him came a procession, Henderson driving a cart loaded with tools, Cooper and his sons carrying window frames, Sheriff Wilson with bags of nails. "What is this?" Mark asked, as the wagons and men continued to arrive. "Rebuilding party," Jacob explained simply. "Brought enough supplies to get your walls and roof up before sundown." Women arrived with food and drink. Martha Miller, Mrs. Lancaster, Mrs. Wilson, and others from town. Children ran excitedly around the edges, eager to help or at least witness the activity. Mark stood speechless as the townspeople organized themselves with practiced efficiency. In frontier communities, barn raisings and cabin buildings were common events, neighbors helping neighbors through the collective effort that ensured survival. But such assistance had never been extended to him before. "Where do we start?" he asked finally. Jacob grinned. "It's your home. You're the foreman on this job." By midday, the foundation was laid, larger than the original cabin, with space for 2 rooms as Ayla had wished. Mark showed the men how to notch the logs in the Apache way, creating stronger corners than the typical frontier cabin. "Clever," Cooper observed, studying the technique. "Saves on nails too." As the walls began to rise, Ayla moved among the workers with a bucket of water, offering drinks to the laboring men. Her proud smile whenever someone complimented the emerging cabin warmed Mark more than the autumn. Late afternoon brought the roof beams, muscled into place by a dozen straining men. Mark climbed to secure the ridgepole, driving in the first nail with 3 solid strikes. The assembled crowd cheered at this traditional moment, marking progress toward completion. As he descended, Mark noticed Mayor Simmons approaching, with something cradled carefully in his hands. The object is rough-hewn but clearly crafted with care, a stone block with smoothed faces, approximately the size of a bread loaf. "The foundation stone," Mayor Simmons announced, presenting it to Mark. "It's tradition to place a marked stone in the foundation of a new home." Mark accepted the stone, turning it to find an inscription chiseled into one face: "Mark and Ayla Rivers, home." "River?" Mark questioned, running his fingers over the engraved letters. The mayor looked uncomfortable. "Well, if you're adopting her properly, she'll take your surname, won't she?" "I assumed, if that's not right." "It is right," Mark interrupted, softly. "Thank you." Ayla pressed against his side, examining the stone with wonder. "Rivers," she repeated. "Ayla Rivers." Together they placed the foundation stone in the corner nearest the hearth that Cooper was already constructing of river rock and clay. Mark positioned it carefully, ensuring the inscription faced inward toward the home, rather than out toward the world. A private affirmation rather than a public declaration. Work continued until dusk, painted the sky in hues of orange and purple. Lanterns were lit as men secured the last roof beams and began laying wooden shingles. Women spread food on makeshift tables, calling workers to eat in shifts, so the momentum wouldn't be lost. Standing slightly apart from the activity, Mark watched the community. His community now labored to restore what had been taken from him. And Ayla, the foundation stone, lay hidden in the structure's bones, but he could feel its presence, solid and reassuring. Sheriff Wilson joined him, passing a tin cup of coffee. "Quite a change from your welcome 17 years ago," he observed. Mark nodded. "I built that first cabin alone, in silence. And now look," Wilson gestured to the organized chaos of construction. "Half the town turning out. Why?" Mark asked, the question that had haunted him since the petition. "Why now?" Wilson considered this. "Folks are funny. They can hold on to prejudice for years, then drop it in an instant when something cuts through the nonsense." He sipped his coffee. "For some, it was seeing how you cared for Ayla during her illness. For others, standing up to Crawford showed courage they admired. For the rest," he shrugged, "maybe they just needed time to see the man behind the labels they'd pasted on you." As darkness fell completely, Jacob called for a halt to the day's work. The cabin's shell stood complete, walls up, roof on, windows framed. The interior remained unfinished, but the structure would keep out weather. "We'll be back tomorrow to finish," Jacob announced. "Floor, doors and interior walls." As the townspeople gathered their tools and prepared to leave, Ayla climbed onto a stump, raising her voice with unexpected authority for a child. "Thank you," she called, silencing the murmured conversation. "This is the best home I've ever had, even better than before." Her simple gratitude touched something in the gathered crowd. Mothers wiped away tears, fathers nodded gruffly, children beamed at their new friend. That night, Mark and Ayla slept in the miller's spare room one last time. Tomorrow they would return to their own land, their own home, different from what had been destroyed, but somehow more meaningful for having been built by many hands. The foundation stone lay unseen beneath the new cabin's corner, bearing their shared name, a permanent mark in a world where so much proved temporary. River, an apt name for people whose lives had flowed over rough terrain, around obstacles, always moving forward, gradually reshaping the landscape through which they passed.